I saw a few people nodding.
My other basic question...
Google distributed autonomous corporations, it's all there.
What do you have against VCs? Everything you do is trying to cut them out.
It's the ecosystem. So venture capitalists actually perform some very important roles, and even if you look at AngelList, we're not actually getting rid of venture capitalists, we're creating a new generation of venture capitalists, which sort of operate online through our syndicates program, where angels can sort of become VCs on the spot and get people to back them. But fundamentally, the internet, and this is Michael Lewis's observation, the internet hates middlemen who make a living through proprietary access to information. So to the extent that anyone relies on proprietary access to information, whether it's a closed source developer or whether it's a VC who has captive deal flow in some small market, the internet's going to blow that open. Talk to the internet, not me.
Do you have to go around disrupting everything?
I had nothing to do with Bitcoin. I wish I was, Satoshi Nakamoto involved in the early thing. It's a brilliant scheme.
All right, let's take that first question.
Yeah, my curious question is, when you have a system like this, especially with Bitcoin, it acts as a commodity, right? Very much so. So basically, how are you going to handle the risks of those incredible swings in value that come with the commoditization of a currency and or corporation?
Yeah, if you look at the stock market, the value of public companies goes up and down all the time, and those are highly stable late-stage enterprises. The value of private companies actually varies on a daily basis. You just don't have access to that information because that market's not liquid. You just don't see it. Like anyone who's run a startup knows that like some mornings you wake up and you're about to go out of business, and some mornings you wake up and you're about to take over the world. And if somebody actually knew all the information, quote a price on that stock, it would be insanely volatile. So volatile is a feature of efficient markets. It reflects good access to information. It doesn't reflect something wrong or horrible. Bitcoin at the moment is volatile because it doesn't really have a strong native use case. We don't use Bitcoin today in a context where some other payment mechanism doesn't work. I would argue that Bitcoin will find those native use cases over time, and they'll probably be in code, machine to machine, and networks and protocols and microtransactions. When that happens, the price may stabilize. At the moment, Bitcoin is essentially a better electronic gold. It's a store of value, and it's got like a big option of what might happen in the future. So as its possibility of taking over from gold as a store of value changes on a daily basis from 0.01% to 0.02%, you get massive volatility in the price. But for an instantaneous transaction, like if I'm sending you money online, that really doesn't matter because I'll convert from dollars to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin with a transmission mechanism, when it gets to you, it converts back to dollars. So I don't think the volatility at the moment impacts most of the use cases that we're talking about. And this is a more sophisticated discussion, but every medium of exchange essentially becomes a store of value over time. And any store of value that is fungible becomes a medium of exchange over time. The two are very hard to separate out.
Well, you have to lower transaction friction first, which is a big problem right now, correct?
It is in certain contexts. If my computer wants to talk to your computer, it's easier for it to talk in Bitcoin than in US dollars.
So related to that, the question I had for you when you told me you wanted to talk about this was, we have ways of making your method is just a way of making equity in a company electronic. Mm-hmm. We have ways of making electronic shares. There's a company, eShares, that startups can use to make their cap tables completely electronic from the beginning.
Yeah, but that's insanely complicated stuff. I mean, like, if I want to issue somebody shares in my corporation in exchange for them using my product, or I want them to pay me in shares and go and buy them on a market, I mean, that's just insanely complicated stuff.
They could pay you in Bitcoin and you could issue them these electronic shares.
Yeah, I mean, the management of the cap table, the shareholder rights that go with it, how to do dividends, the accounting, the accredited investor stuff. I mean, it's a whole different ball of wax. It's I don't even know what the proper analogy is, but it's a completely different scheme. At the end of the day, currency, language, communication, exchange, these things are all variations of the same thing. And so I think Bitcoin is calling that out. Like, for example, there's this concept that we have in the world called capital controls, that I can stop you from moving money from one country to another. But now money is just becoming language. So I can encode $1 billion in Bitcoin in a wallet that's in plain English and record it in my head, and I can cross a a national boundary and no one can stop me. So when currency becomes language, how do you separate the two out? So I think it's more fundamental than that. We've created these artificial constructs called shares and equities, and we've wrapped all these rules and features around them, but those features kind of aren't needed. It's just language. And Bitcoin's calling that bluff.
I don't know how to choose between 4 questions. The first one.
In a world of distributed autonomous corporations, where do governments fit in? Where do taxes fit in? Where do lawyers fit in? Laws, legal? How does all that play into the world of distributed?
I don't think it's pretty. I mean, I don't think it's a good, necessarily a good outcome for people who are used to making a living a certain way. I think it happens hopefully slowly enough that it's not terribly disruptive. But it does mean that for people who feel that we have been a little too restrained in our activities, where the current models of how to do things are being frozen by governments and regulators and institutions, it gives an escape into the cloud. Unfortunately, I do think a lot of the innovation relevant here will not come in the United States. Because the reason that regulators and lawyers and governments are just stronger here. So you're going to see a lot of this innovation happening overseas, or anonymously Satoshi style.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about actually voting at home or study at home becoming, I guess, a processing for currency, or I guess a more, how would you actually equate, I guess, work to the value of money actually?
So I'm supposed to repeat the questions, but
okay. The question is, what about using folding at home or SETI at home as kind of the underlying hashing mechanism for some of these kinds of currencies? Actually, that turned out to be a really bad idea. And Satoshi Nakamoto himself went into this on the message boards a while back, and I don't remember his complete argument, but I remember it being convincing. And it was something along the lines of that you want the hashing function to be chosen as best in its own merits and not for some other functionality. Otherwise, it creates security issues with the underlying blockchain. So for example, in that Dropbox coin example that I used, you wouldn't use a proof of work function like you did in Bitcoin. You would do a proof of available storage function. It's less gameable. It corresponds to actual resources in the network. Anyway, I think you can argue all day long about what the best underlying hashing function is. There are new coins that use something called a proof of stake function that doesn't require any heavy computation and does away with the whole mining networks. It's possible we might see Bitcoin or equivalent get displaced by one of them. Or Ripple, for example, uses a proof of consensus function, which is also far more efficient. So that's beyond the level of this audience, I think, and frankly, my level as well.
We have a guy with a Ripple sweatshirt who has a question.
So you mentioned...
Do you work for Ripple?
I'm a super fan, but I also work. So you mentioned that this idea of languages as an analog to currencies for new types of coins. And I think that Bitcoin represents a convergence of currencies, a convergence of languages. I would say the more coins that you issue, the more difficult it is to translate one coin to another, or as you would one language to another. Do you see a convergence of currencies and languages and coins, or do you see a fragmentation, depending on which? How do you see the whole hang with that?
Yeah, so I think there's four different classes of coins.
Do you want to summarize that question?
Yeah, sorry, the question is, if currency is like language, do we get to one language or do we have many? Do we have many currencies or one currency? I think we have many currencies, but I think something like a Bitcoin becomes a reserve currency. It's the main currency that you go in and out of. The language equivalent would be the lingua franca. And then you have a whole bunch of other domain-specific languages and currencies. Why? Well, there's a set of things that Bitcoin cannot do. Bitcoin can't do smart contracts fully. The scripting language doesn't enable it. And you don't want it to, because if it's going to be a currency, you want it to be really secure. So you don't want it to have a Turing-complete scripting language underneath. So things like Ethereum and Ripple do a better job at contracts and these Turing-complete languages. So those are doing things that Bitcoin cannot do. Bitcoin also takes a long time to clear the transaction blocks. It's 10 minutes per block. You need 6 clearances to be valid. So it's 60 minutes to clear a transaction. In reality, if we're doing machine-to-machine microtransactions, I want something that clears in a microsecond. No one's even designed that yet. And if you did do that, it would actually be a less secure coin because you have less mining power going in total per time. So that's another thing Bitcoin cannot do, so you're going to want another coin to do that. Then there's a set of things that Bitcoin will choose not to do. Like they could do it, but they choose not to do it. Example is Zero Coin or Zero Cash. The Bitcoin core developers explicitly rejected making it fully anonymous because they don't want Bitcoin to be banned by the US government. So that's another thing that Bitcoin chooses not to do. And then finally, with a lot of these other applications, like I was sort of making up on the fly, you want the core developers to have an incentive to have done all the work to create these new kinds of applications, and so they will likely mint their own coin. Another example is Namecoin, which is a key value store inside of it that helps you do lookups in distributed DNS and identity. That's also something Bitcoin can't do. So you're going to have many different kinds of coins, but a lot of these coins will do what's called merge mining with Bitcoin whenever possible, so they can rely on Bitcoin's hashing infrastructure and network, and some of them can't, like a fast coin or a Ripple consensus coin can't rely on merge mining with Bitcoin. So we're going to see a whole host of them. Languages do have a strong network effect to them, so I see it's going to be hard for someone to displace Bitcoin as kind of that core reserve currency unless there's just some absolute fundamental use case that the base currency has to have that Bitcoin is missing, which is always possible, but haven't seen it yet.
Okay, wait, hang on, Mr. Ripple there. We're out of time for questions for Naval. Naval, stay right there. We'll walk off the stage together. But you'll be sticking around through lunch, I think.
Yeah,
so find him and bug him. So I'm going to bring up our MCs to fully introduce the next panel.